Welcome to Between the Rows, where you get to hear the stories behind the stories in Canada's leading farm publications. Between the Rows podcast is brought to you by Glacier FarmMedia and sponsored by FCC Ag Expert, Canada's #1 field and accounting software. Try it for free at agexpert.ca.
Hello and welcome to Between the Rows. I'm Ed White, your host this week. Today we're going to hear about how China might or might not, or is or isn't reacting to the continued detention of a Huawei executive in Canada. We'll get an update on the markets from Glacier Markets Farm. We'll hear from an expert on Canada's food industry about how it has done so far during the COVID crisis. But first, has the shock of COVID-19 actually helped those farmers who sell direct to the consumer? We've heard lots of predictions that we should see that, but what's really happened? I'm joined now by Geraldine Witchers of the Manitoba Co-operator to discuss this. Hello, Geraldine, and welcome to the show.
Hello.
So you've been taking a bit of a look at this, as have a number of reporters. What's your sense right now of what's really happening with direct-to-the-consumers sales by farmers?
So when we saw the closures of some of the meat plants a little bit earlier this year, there was a definite bump in meat sales especially, and that seems to have continued. I guess people are maybe a bit concerned about the meat supply chains, and it feels a little safer to buy really close to home. And so I've had one farm I spoke to said that they were selling out sort of on their monthly direct sale orders, and they had their bulk, so like sides of beef, quarters of beef, booked all the way into 2021. So I mean that's pretty intense demand for a small farm like that. When it comes to other products, I have heard some reports that the CSAs, so the vegetable subscription type programs, are also seeing a bump in demand. That hasn't come exceptionally clear to me yet. That might only sort of develop as the growing season progresses.
Yeah, I can say, one of those CSAs I signed up with after this whole mess started, because I started thinking, I wouldn't mind having a bit more of a diversified base of where I get my vegetables from.
Mm-hmm. One farm that I follow on Instagram was also selling bedding plants, because there's been quite an increase in interest in people growing their own vegetables and growing their own gardens. So I guess they were able to sort of capitalize on that. And then another small vegetable farm that I also follow was giving out gardening advice, which seems kind of counterproductive since that they sell vegetables. But I guess, part of their model is to build relationships with people. So it makes business sense, I guess, to give out good advice and not just good vegetables.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed when I've spoken to a few of these farmers that are involved in this is they really don't seem to see themselves as competing against others in the same way that I think a lot of business and a lot of maybe mainstream agriculture does. They kind of have a just less of that sense of sort of fighting over the same consumer, or fighting over the same dollar. They seem to think they can just grow and grow and grow their part of the market of the industry.
Mm-hmm. Well, at this point, direct sales of meat and of vegetables and other products really don't represent a very big part of the food sector in Manitoba or Canada as a whole. So really they do have a fair bit of field to play as far as not really overlapping with each other, because they're all pretty small. But also the definite sense that I've gotten from spending time with these farmers and reporting on them is that they really do feel the need to band together to be taken seriously, because they are so small. And so it really doesn't make sense for them to fight with each other, because they really need their combined voices to get anything done in terms of policy.
You mentioned that you were following, one or some at least on things like Instagram. I follow quite a few on Twitter, and I see they have Facebook pages too, a lot of them. Is that your sense that the folks that are doing this tend to be pretty digitally savvy?
Not to say that all of them are. It might depend a little bit on the age or demographic of the farmer. But yeah, that does seem to be a pretty good component, especially I think in like the vegetable farming sphere, because you can sure make a pretty picture out of some of your produce and so forth. And I also see a lot of farm pets getting brought into the picture because nothing does so well as pets do on social media. Social media is definitely a big part of it.
And, this part of the sort of smaller scale and more direct-to-consumer farm marketing, we're hearing a lot about the potential there and the good luck there, but there's another whole wing that isn't doing as well in terms of the farmers markets in the cities these days. Is that the sense you're getting? I know, here in Winnipeg, the St. Norbert's Farmers Market is like really been trying to figure ways to deal with the new reality. What's your sense of how farmers markets are coping with their ability to get to the consumer?
They've definitely been forced to adapt. I know early on in the spring, there was definitely some concern from farmers that are we even going to have markets to sell at? Do we even start planting crops? And so there was definitely pressure on Direct Farm Manitoba and the market organizers to find a way to make things work despite safety measures that have to be in place. And so St. Norbert, of course, has been online now for quite a few weeks. And then Direct Farm Manitoba also got a what would you call it? A grant, I guess, from the federal and provincial government to buy a platform that could help put the rest of the markets online as well. In terms of sales, I guess I don't know for sure how their sales have been affected, if they've dropped or gone up or anything like that. But I have heard that the actual traffic at the St. Norbert's Farmers Market has been down, like the foot traffic has been down. But their drive-through pickup sort of center for their online sales has been pretty busy.
Yeah, a lot of amazing adaptation going on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks very much, Geraldine, for joining us today about this.
Yeah, for sure.
That was Geraldine Witchers, who is a reporter with the Manitoba Co-operator. This is Between the Rows. This is a question I also looked at for a story in the June 4th Western Producer. I spoke with Professor Simon Samoji of the University of Guelph, and this is some of what he told me. I started out by asking him a question that's come to a few of us, and a few of us have written about, which is, has Canada's food supply system during this pandemic been a disaster or a success?
To answer what you said, if you take a step back, and I know it's a bit tricky, but take a step back and look at the food system as a whole. It's a system that has to rapidly adapt to its circumstances. It provides a highly perishable product generally speaking, a highly perishable product that's not standardized, that it's not like making cars or airplanes where everything is simple, comes off, your input supplies, the way you produce is factory, everything comes out perfect each time. Wholesalers, retailers, processors, they're always having to adapt to suppliers not being able to get the product in on time, weather events, changes in production location, those sort of things. So it's already a system that's pretty adaptive to changes in its surround.
I asked the professor also about what all this public attention to and all this public scrutiny of Canada's food system has meant for the public perception of Canada's food supply.
Yeah, to what you said, Ed, that, up until COVID, arguably the average Canadian understood retailing because, they go to grocery stores and they understand how that works and how you buy a product, and they had a reasonable idea about what farming does, but nothing about the businesses in between those two businesses. And it's really shed a light on how the food they gets to their plate. I think there's been a lot of talk from pundits that the food system's broken. I think I mentioned this before. it's not broken. In my mind, it's how should I put this? Let me get my brain around the words. It's a system that is flexible in its design. It has to be, because we have to get food on our plates.
I asked Professor Somogyi about what all the attention as well to the question of foreign labor on Canada's farms and in Canada's agriculture means, and about the idea that perhaps some of Canada's unemployed workers could be quickly employed on Canada's farms.
I recognize that those jobs require a lot of specific skills. We don't just import a lot of people from, say, Central America or Caribbean to work on our farms because they're cheap. It's because they know how to plant, harvest, they understand food safety, they understand market specification issues. So they're definitely not low-skilled labour. So I think that's one angle that people might be getting a little bit wrong.
You can see a written version of our conversation in this week's Western Producer. There have been developments in Canada's diplomatic dispute with China, but has anything changed in terms of Canada's agriculture trade? I'm joined by Sean Pratt of the Western Producer now to talk about that. Hello, Sean, and welcome to Between the Rows.
Hey, Ed.
So, what has happened and what is happening?
Well, what has happened is that the BC Supreme Court ruled that the extradition case against Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou could proceed. And I guess that's what's happened. And I spoke to a bunch of people in the industry and asked them about their thoughts on that. And what they're concerned about is what may happen as a result of that ruling. They're worried that there could be further reprisals from China.
And, how are we going to know if that happens? The Chinese, the first go-rounds with canola and pork and beef didn't really put out a press release or make an official statement that they were doing that for this diplomatic reason. How are we going to figure out if something's happening like that?
Well, I guess the industry will know if all of a sudden there's some non-tariff trade barrier erected in the next week or two here. They'll have a pretty good idea why it went up. China has never said that it restricted canola exports because of this detention of this Huawei executive, but everybody and their dog knows that's what happened. And so I think it'll be pretty obvious if there's suddenly a non-tariff trade barrier erected for a certain ag commodity.
Now, from the people you spoke to this week, has anyone seen anything immediately following that BC Supreme Court ruling?
No, there's been nothing immediately happening, and nobody that I spoke to said that there's any inkling that there will be. But every single one of them are all very nervous because, as you and I know, China is known for this kind of reprisal. They've done it against the U.S. They've done it against Australia with their barley exports. They've done it against Canada with, as you alluded to, oil seeds and pork and beef. So there's a lot of trepidation out there. Many of the industry folks say they're concerned, but they also say there's nothing really you can do about it. You can just sort of deal with it when it happens.
Yeah, I know it. The sort of lack of immediacy, I'm sure adds a bit of stress to the industry's not being able to know if something is or isn't going to happen. Because I know with canola, it was 2 or 3 months after the arrest of Meng that there was anything that we saw directly that all of a sudden there was a problem with the canola shipments. It didn't seem to happen for a couple of months, and then all of a sudden, screech.
Yeah, that's the way it works. And so, like I say, a lot of these groups are kind of biting their nails and worried what could happen. I spoke to a couple of analysts and asked them, what their thoughts were. These were grain industry analysts. So I asked them, what could be the next target on the grain side of things. And so Neil Townsend with FarmLink Marketing Solutions, he wondered if he doesn't think it'll be barley because China's already in a dispute with Australia and has erected like an 80% tariff against Australian barley exports. So he doesn't think that they can cut off Australian supplies and Canadian supplies. So that one might be given a pass. But he thinks yellow peas could be a potential target. And Bruce Burnett with Markets Farm also thought that yellow peas could be one of the targets. We ship a lot of yellow peas to China. So I spoke to Greg Cherewick, president of Pulse Canada, to get his take on that. And, he said there's been no inkling that China's going to erect some sort of non-tariff trade barrier or tariff trade barrier against peas or any other pulses. He said that Canada has very consistently met their phytosanitary requirements over the last 20 years, so that he doesn't think there's anything that he's aware of in that regard that they couldn't address if there was a phytosanitary issue. And he also mentioned that pea protein use in China has exploded. It's gone up 140% over the last 3 years. And Canada supplies 95% of those peas. So China needs the peas. So, but he did acknowledge that, it's the industry has become far too dependent on a few markets like China and India, and that there's a big risk in that these days because the world is drifting away from rules-based trade. So, he said the industry has been working on diversification strategies for many, many years, not just now because there's this potential looming threat, but they've been, 5-10 years ago have started trying to diversify into new markets.
And with this situation between China and Canada, the situation in BC with the BC Supreme Court ruling, that's hardly the end of this matter, is it? It's just one of the many steps in a legal process that could take years.
Yeah, exactly. And but I guess it's a step that the Chinese were hoping wouldn't happen, and some of the folks in the ag industry were hoping wouldn't happen either because I spoke to Dan Darling he's the president of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, and his hope was that there would be an outcome that would pave the way for a return to some sort of normalcy in trade with China, but obviously that's not the case. And so he says, he says this is very troubling and very concerning. He wonders, like everyone else, what could be the next target. His hope is that common sense will prevail, and China, at some point, China can't keep targeting ag products from every country it has a dispute with because they need to feed their citizens. So he's hoping that, they're kind of running out of options there, but who knows?
They certainly seem to be piling up the disputes because, like you say, they're having fights with Australia most recently, but obviously with the United States, it's none too friendly between those two. With Canada, and there's various European countries in little spats too. So I suppose at some point, like you say, they've got to figure out who they want to punish most.
Yeah, and the hope is that maybe they've sort of done all they can do in terms of targeting the ag sector. But like the analysts were saying, that there are things that there are commodities that we ship over there that could potentially be targeted. Like flax is another one. We ship a lot of flax China, and that's our biggest market for that commodity. So China is the biggest market for a lot of our commodities. That's the real worrisome part of all this.
So it's an anxious situation, and I guess I can wish you, good luck in covering this for what might be the next few years. Well, thanks for joining us today, Sean.
Thank you, Ed.
Sean Pratt is a reporter with the Western Producer. This is Between the Rows. Now let's switch from talking about Canada's messed up relationship with China to talking about the messed up relationship of the U.S. and China. I'm joined by Glenn Halleck of Glacier Markets Farm to talk about that. Hello, Glenn, and welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Ed.
So, Glenn, what's going on now with this ongoing soap opera of the U.S. and China scrapping over trade?
Okay, so relations between the United States and China have soured in recent weeks and months, largely for three reasons. One is the Trump administration continues to blame China for all of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we've also seen China flexing its military muscles in the South China Sea and with Taiwan. And now we have the continuing pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong. With the pandemic, these demonstrations didn't stop. They just, like everyone else, started wearing masks over their faces. And it's gotten to the point where China decided to impose a new security law on Hong Kong. That in turn has angered the Trump administration, which is threatening to take action should China go ahead with this new security law. And right now we're at the point where yesterday the Chinese government ordered its state-owned businesses to stop importing farm goods from the U.S. And of course the big item being U.S. soybeans. So that's where we are right now.
And this is what China has been saying it's going to do, or has been reported as having said to its purchasers and importers. What's the view in the markets of how firm that will be and how much of that will actually happen?
Well, what we saw yesterday, there were rumors in the media that China did buy three cargoes of soybeans. And this morning, there was an announcement from the U.S. Department of Agriculture that there was a private sale of about 132,000 tons of soybeans to China. Our understanding is that's not being bought by state-owned enterprises in China. That could be privately owned businesses in China doing that.
And I guess if we remember right from our canola dispute as well with China, the Chinese government seemed to allow existing business that was on the books to be completed, but then things just stopped happening after that.
That's something that could be happening right now. Under the Phase 1 trade agreement that was signed back in January, China was to buy $40 billion of farm purchases from the U.S. They barely started that, and that $40 billion for this year alone is $12 billion more than what China has ever bought in U.S. farm imports. And then on top of that, next year is to be $50 billion. And what do we see? China is buying soybeans from Brazil instead.
So it's a bit of a sort of a shell game of switching around the commodities that China needs then.
Oh, yes. With the pandemic, China quickly found itself in the shortage of soybeans, and they've been buying them, as quickly as they can from Brazil, because Brazil's currency, the real, is far, far lower than the greenback.
And what have we seen in the markets now? Reaction, I guess, in the soybean markets. What have we seen in the canola markets? How is that working out?
Well, yesterday on Monday, soybeans took a bit of a dive. But then there came these rumors that China had bought 3 cargoes of U.S. soybeans, and by the end of the day, soybeans were only down about a quarter of a cent, which is not too bad considering all of the commotion that had been going on. Now for canola, Monday was not a great day. The July contract for canola lost $4 a ton. That's not so much what had been happening with U.S. soybeans and soy oil. Rather, it was the spike in the Canadian dollar. Yesterday alone, the loonie shot up almost 0.8 cents, which is a pretty big one-day jump.
And I guess soon we're going to maybe be able to switch a little bit out of talking about all these political issues and diplomatic disputes and pandemics, and hopefully be able to talk about the crops growing in the field.
Yeah, things are looking pretty good across the prairies. As of last week, Manitoba farmers were about 2/3 finished. The farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta, they're roughly around 80% finished. Now, that'll change over the course of the coming days as the new crop reports come in. Manitoba and Saskatchewan are supposed to be relatively rain-free this week. There's more rain further to the west in Alberta, especially in the north. That's kind of holding up spring planting. But on the whole, things are looking pretty good for crops so far this year.
Let's keep our fingers crossed and hope it keeps on looking good. So thanks very much, Glenn, for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much, Ed.
Glenn Halleck is a reporter with Glacier Markets Farm. That's all for this week. Join us next week for another edition of Between the Rows. I'm Ed White, and I wish you all a productive and safe week of farming.
Between the Rows podcast is brought to you by Glacier FarmMedia and sponsored by FCC Ag Expert, Canada's #1 field and accounting software. Try it for free at agexpert.ca.